And I'll now introduce our final speaker of our first session of the seminar. So we are happy to welcome Nuri McBride, who is a perfumer, writer, and educator who specializes in olfactive cultural education and preserving traditional fragrance modalities. She owns Atropos Parfums and Consultancy and co-edits the community-focused journal Alabastron. She's been exploring the connection between olfaction and death rituals through her Death Scent project. In addition, her monthly newsletter, Aromatica de Profundis, is an accessible resource to learn about historical fragrance formulae. In recent years, she's collaborated with several prestigious organizations, including the World Sensorium, the Institute for Art and Olfaction, and the British Society of Perfumers, and Europa. She's going to hopefully correct a lot of my pronunciations here. All right. Thank you for being with us, Ms. McBride.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone at the museum. This is so exciting, and I'm so excited to present this material for you today. And I'll just get right into it so that we can make sure we cover everything. So first off, let me thank you for allowing me to contribute to our conversation today. It was really lovely hearing the other speakers with my presentation, which is Twin Flames, Vessel and Fragrance Development in the Ancient Near East. And let's just make sure all the slides do the slidey things. Are we seeing the slide? There we go. Just a little lag on my side. So my objectives today, this is going to be pretty much a brief overview, is to instill the notion that perfume and perfume vessel production in the ancient Near East were not two completely separate histories that just happened to cohabitate the same products. Instead, fragrance vessels developed to meet the needs of perfumery, and ancient fragrance was defined by its vessels. This was a synergistic relationship that evolved over a very long period of time. Perfume in the ancient Near East was a nexus of compromise and innovation between the juice and the vessel. If unglazed pottery is the only option that perfumery has for creating, its creativity is limited by the scope that unglazed pottery affords. And likewise, the desire for and the limitations of perfumes in antiquity created enormous opportunities for vessel innovation. And it's at this nexus where we see the perfumer as a professional engaged in a dialogue with other artisans like potters, alabaster and ivory carvers, metalsmiths, gem cutters, and glass workers. And I believe that these histories of fragrance and fragrance vessels, in particularly the ancient Near East, are too interconnected and codependent to be separated out into really different fields of study. Instead, I advocate for a co-development perspective, that the historical conditions and the technological limitations that were affecting Near Eastern vessel making was also affecting fragrance production. So when we study these things together, we get a greater understanding of larger forces that were at play in the region for their material culture. And as companion objects, when we study them together, we see how circumstances in one craft affected the development in the other, and vice versa. So today we're going to examine really kind of more overarching themes and conditions that shaped perfumery and specialty vessel making in the ancient Near East from about the Bronze Age to just towards the end of the classical period. And first and foremost, I want to briefly discuss what ancient fragrance was and its many packaging challenges. And then we'll explore the social environment and working relationship between the perfumer and the vessel maker. And then finally, we'll see how those factors manifest into material relationships between the vessel and the fragrance. And we'll do that through several fabrics before we get to glass. Now let's change slides here. Okay. So first, let's talk about ancient perfume. Ancient perfume is extremely different in many significant ways from its modern counterparts. Ancient Near Eastern fragrances were a form of bodily adornment that placed aromatic materials in a suspension of fat, be that plant or animal, and water. And these were prepared into either a liquid form or thickened into an unguent. Now, the applying of fatty substances to the skin to cleanse and beautify and heal has a very long history around the globe. However, this very functional act was elevated in the ancient Fertile Crescent as well as in the Indus River Valley by infusing oils with aromatic material. And this could have happened as early as the late Neolithic period. And in time, this developed where the odor of the substance was as important, if not more, than the other qualities that the oil brought. And fragrance production began as a domestic craft, not as a professional one. And it began in the Fertile Crescent, born out of culinary skills and tools. However, by the time we get to the middle of the Bronze period, very early in the run of this history, there is already a professional trade in aromatics that is emerging with highly skilled artisans engaged in a type of transnational commerce. And professional aromatics making also became deeply embedded in the region's religions, in its cultures, and in statecraft. Scent was extremely important. So once perfume transitioned from the kitchen to the perfumer's workshop, it also moved from sort of the multi-use kitchen pot to dedicated equipment for its production and its storage. However, the consumer's presentation vessel, the sort of, the bottle you would buy today as we would see it, and the fragrance within it, those were not yet bonded into a single commodity. Close, but not quite there yet. Ancient perfume was also very versatile, and it could be simultaneously a fragrance, a color cosmetic, a medicine, a flavoring, a status symbol, and a cult object. And that's something that stayed with perfume for a very long time. And the perfume professional also had multiple roles. So we see them as also priests, as palace servants, spicers, apothecasts, and traders in other luxury goods. And these professionals offered other aromatic adornments like incense, fragrance cones, and aromatic jewelry. But today we're just going to talk about oils and unguents for brevity's sake. Let's pull up our slides. So, a key difference between ancient and modern fragrances is the presence of a preservation system. Alcohol was not a suspension medium or a preservation system in ancient perfumery, and this is extremely important. Why there was wine, mead, and beer that sometimes was used, these were aromatic components that did not have high enough content to preserve. This lack of effective preservation gave ancient fragrances a very short shelf life because fat plus water plus human fingies equals a breeding ground for bacteria, which is something, if you make oil-based products, we still deal with today. Now, we see some evidence, especially from later Greek sources, indicating that some fragrances in their production were refrigerated by being suspended in wells and airtight containers. But this was rare in production, and it was almost impossible for users to have a comparable refrigeration system. Likewise, you won't see essential oils. Essential oil extraction from distillation was not possible in the time frame that we're talking about between the Bronze Age and the Classical period. There's evidence of sublimation and of possible attempts at extraction, but this was not the norm. Instead, what ancient perfumery aimed to do was to access very large aromatic molecules by infusing the aromata into a base, and that was done via heat, suspension, or manual manipulation. And these techniques created products that were less intense and as consistent as modern ones. So extracting and storage limitations really affected the possible scent profiles that were achievable in ancient fragrance. For instance, if you had very small molecules, like from citrus has very small molecules, it was almost impossible to both extract it and to contain it. And ancient fragrances required aging, fermenting, and conditioning. Traditional fragrances today do as well, but in the past, you absolutely had to do this to reduce unpleasant odors and to meld the product together. So a great example of this is tiships. Tiships is an Egyptian unguent, and we have a formula for it where it says it takes 1 day to prepare and then 240 days to mature in airtight containers in the dark. It's a very long maturation period. And the aromata that we see used in fragrances is also more diverse, but it's also more regional, especially the further back we go. Botanicals like plants, woods, and fruits, obviously this makes sense, those were being used, but the animal products like organ fat and milk also used, and minerals, including toxic ones like cinnabar. And when we talk about Bronze Age fragrances, sort of the farthest back evidence we have of fragrance, is the farthest back we're going to today anyway, we see components that are from the area of the Near East exactly. What you won't see is things that at the time were in East Asia. So agarwood, deer musk, sandalwood, jasmine, they're not there. We see these as part of Middle Eastern perfumery today, mostly because of the Middle Ages. So these substances would eventually arrive, but they arrived slowly over time. They didn't show up right from the very, very beginning. Okay. Vessels, however, were incredibly important to ancient perfumery. They weren't just containers. This is where you would construct and produce fragrances. They were also necessary for the product's finishing and survival. The vessel needed to slow evaporation, it needed to protect the product from the sun, and it needed to help control temperature and withstand transport, which was definitely not, first class air flights. And vessel designs that emerged over time helped develop so that it limited how much contact you had with fingers going into the jar. And all of those long, narrow stems that helped protect the product and extend its shelf life. Also, before glass, the formula's reactivity to the vessel fabric had to be accounted for. This had to be something you considered. And a skilled technician could use that vessel fabric and those limitations to their benefit or against their benefit, depending on the circumstances. And vessels, of course, were a key component in the sensual experience of applying fragrances, and they were signifiers of value. So, in short, it took ancient vessels to make ancient perfume. The two can't be easily pried apart from each other. So now let's talk very briefly about what and where this work took place. A critical historical point to remember throughout our discussion is that of the late Bronze Age collapse, which began in the 12th century BCE. Before then, society in the Near East was rapidly developing and urbanizing between the late Neolithic and the late Bronze period. And there was this rise of complex social structures and class hierarchies that coalesced around religion and the military. And this created the twin pillars of ancient Near Eastern society, the temple and the palace. This is very important. Early fragrance and luxury vessel trades were incubated within the temple palace systems, not within a commercial market one. And this affected how and when and why fragrances and their vessels were being made. The temple palace system was a social system, but it was also an economic one. Resources would flow into a centralized administration, the temple or the palace, and then they were processed and distributed according to royal prerogative. For example, palace workers would receive raw materials from the administration to create incense for the court. And then there'd be other royal specialists who made the braziers to burn that incense. So who had access to either those braziers or the incense was strictly controlled within this system. Perfume and ornate, particularly ornate presentation vessels were the purview of royal and religious patrons long before they were consumer goods. Vessel makers and perfumers worked within this same Bronze Age temple palace system, and they were serving the same lords. Now, my area of focus is mostly into Mesopotamia and looking into the Mesopotamian perfumery texts. And in those texts, I have yet to find, unfortunately, a direct communication between vessel workshops and royal perfumeries. But there is complaints, quite lovely and bureaucratically, complaints and requests from the perfumeries to the central administrations, asking for vessels or asking for better vessels. And it seems that those kinds of conversations, at least officially, had to go up to management. And that creates a very different environment in the temple palace system. So fragrance and its vessels were not born out of, an artistic desire to express oneself or just based off of market demand. Instead, it really was a committee of administrators and craftspeople working together to please their elite patrons, whether those be high priests or whether they're going to be kings. However, there's also indications that, perfumers and bottle makers probably did communicate with each other directly. The perfume workshop is near the alabaster carving workshop in the Southern Palace in Babylon and also in the central Nineveh Palace. And this strategic placement within the palace structure likely facilitated regular communication between the two workshops. And this geographic closeness isn't limited to Mesopotamia. In ancient Egypt's royal cities of Amarna, Pi-Ramesses, and Melkata, three cities very important to the early history of glass as well, we see faience, glass, and fragrance workshops all in very near contact with each other within these royal enclosures. So they were important and they were close to each other. And then it all came crashing down. The reasons for the collapse are a bit beyond this talk, but essentially, the apocalypse happened. And this catastrophic moment, we see a dearth of remains for luxury goods for almost 400 years. And both glass and fragrance nearly disappear from the record because the system that helped facilitate their production fell apart. Ecological disaster, economic collapse, mass migration, and intense warfare moved resources away from these temple palace luxuries. It killed their patrons, it destroyed the cities they lived in, and it disrupted the international trade they relied on. Now, while these political and social power of the temple and the palace would reconstitute, the temple palace economy was already waning before the collapse, and it ultimately failed during it. For fragrance to survive as a profession, it needed to reorganize completely. So for the study of ancient perfumery, this is the key moment. There's life before the fall, and then there's life after the fall. And in that after, we see the Iron Age and the slow transition to a market economy. However, for certain goods, like perfume, it existed in a hybrid space. The new elites still valued these as religious items, cultural and political tools, as well as luxuries. But the systems that developed could no longer support their production entirely. A transitional period emerged where dual production systems existed. Sometimes this was resulted in separate elite and consumer systems. So we see this in Mari during the Neo-Babylonian period, and we see this in Second Temple Judea as well, where you have temple palace workshops, and you also have a merchant syndicate existing simultaneously in these cities and areas. Now, for other temple palace perfumeries, they merged with the consumer market. So they were making for the elites, but they also were profiting outside of the palace walls. And we see this in classical Cyprus and Corinth. In other royal systems, they slowly kind of atrophied and became consumers of the commercial sector. And this was the case in late Hellenized Egypt. So the transition from the temple palace system to commercial also changed the nature of the relationship between the perfumer and the vessel makers. No longer were they bound into these royal bureaucracies where they had to go ask a manager when they wanted to get a resupply. They had greater individual independence, but they also had new stressors to serve consumer buyers. However, their relationship was still pivotal as perfumers became vessel consumers. As consumers, perfumers had directly engaged, certainly, with vessel makers to create objects that suited their production needs. And this shift is significant and a significant marker of this transition from centralized temple palace systems to a more commercialized structure. And as this is happening, this transition, we also see the transition of fragrance as a consumer good, which goes from something that only the ultra elite, ultra elite can afford and have access to by the time we get to the Roman period, it's a relatively affordable luxury. A middle class person can definitely have perfume. And that's a very significant transition that this transition into commerce made possible. It wouldn't have been possible without it. So now with this little bit of history and a little bit of this relationship in place, let's talk about the material remains. And first, let's look at earthenware. Some of the earliest fragrance vessels were not precious art objects, but they were modest constructions of pottery. The earliest remains suspected of being involved in fragrance production are implements made from earthenware, stone, leather, and wood. Pottery types common in early perfume making are vats, kettles, cauldrons, measuring cups, settling bowls, sieves, processing bowls, and maturing jars. For a considerable portion of this history as well, earthenware pottery would have been unglazed, and this is very important. Alkali glazes for earthenware would have rendered their vessels impervious to liquids. However, they were not readily available before about 1500 BCE in the Near East. Unglazed earthenware presents significant limitations to perfumery because it is porous. Fat-based products can stain or oil log these objects and embed them with odor. Surface texture also is a breeding ground for bacteria. Even worse is efflorescence, which occurs when water-soluble salts in the perfume phase through the clay of the vessel. Perfumers in antiquity didn't have the means to correct for these salts. Efflorescence creates an unsightly deposit on the outside of the pot. You might see it in your garden pots with terracotta, but more concerningly for us, it fundamentally changes the chemical composition of the fragrance, and it can cause a whole cascade of effects. Efflorescence and embedding would have been major issues the fragrance industry needed to solve, the potter to solve for them in order to produce. Before glazing for presentation vessels, for the consumer vessel within the temple palace system, we rarely see earthenware. And instead, we see Egyptian faience, soft stone, ivory, metal. These materials had their own limitations, but they were worlds more stable, but then also appropriately luxurious. In Syria, earthenware vessels were sometimes burnished in order to help make them less oil sensitive. And in Corinth, blisterware was also developed to help with porosity. But both of these had limited application, and ultimately we see them leave the material record. So from the very beginning, the limitations of unglazed pottery instigated, one, the need for specific vessels for perfume making and storage separate from food, because you're going to taste it. And the issues of preservation incentivized perfume makers to find very, very small containers. And this really sets the stage for cosmetic specific vessels. And some of the most enduring pottery vessel shapes that we have that were adapted into multiple fabrics come from miniaturized versions of food storage. So we have the crateriscos, which is a miniaturized crater, and the amphoriscos, which is a tiny amphora. However, even after the introduction of glazing, fragrance production, the making of perfume, used unglazed pottery, which indicates that it held some advantages. And I think we see that in that there's several Middle and Neo-Assyrian formulas that call for oil that is being matured in a jar to be decanted multiple times into what are referred to as shupatu jars. And shupatu in Akkadian is the word for the middle of the month. So decanting into these jars may have been a way of preventing efflorescence by transferring the oil every 15 days. The jars themselves may have also infused the perfume with aromatic elements from the previous content. And this is a procedure that's still done with leather bottles today in traditional Indian perfumery. So while it's speculation, I think this type of vessel seasoning would have at least been known, if not used, in antiquity. Then there's alabaster. Alabaster was the go-to material that offered improved production, ease of access, and creative flexibility. Alabaster can be carved paper thin, it can be translucent, it can glow. Artists can very easily add precious metals, gemstones, and glass decorations. It also dyes well and can be painted. So this really makes it an ideal material for decorative presentation bottles. But alabaster was also very useful in production and storage. Untreated alabaster is more stable for perfumery, but like earthenware, it's porous. Bronze Age advancements in stoneworking, however, improved alabaster's suitability for perfume at roughly the same time that professional perfume was emerging. Kiln firing and waxing soft stone vessels significantly enhances their strength and porosity. Firing the vessels kind of semi-glazes the stone, and then finishing it with wax seals it. Now, the wax would fade over time, obviously, and bedding would be an issue. So it wasn't as neutral and a solved problem as it would be with glass, but alabaster presented as an option for hardy transport vessels, chemically stable working vessels, and ornate presentation vessels. There's a very real possibility that fragrance may not have been able to professionalize in the Middle Bronze period without these vessel advancements. And another boon that came was the invention of the lathe, not something we think about as in perfumery that much. But the oldest evidence of a stone lathe is from roughly about 1300 BCE. And with it, alabaster could be turned and carved in days instead of in weeks, and had a very low chance of breaking, even when you make it very thin. It also created the possibility of making snug lids, which Professor Green mentioned in the I forget the quotation, but the snug fitting lids, the importance of snug lids. Lathed lids control evaporation better, which means that more delicate aromas remaining in the formula can be discernible. And with a properly fitted lid and a little bit of wax cloth, you can make these objects airtight, which massively improved maturation and sanitation. In fact, these lids fit so well that we have evidence in Egyptian tombs of alabaster unguentarium exploding because of a buildup of methane gas inside of the objects. So these vessel manufacturing improvements created vessels that were better suited for the needs of perfumery, to which the industry responded gleefully. Now let's look at our predecessor to glass, censored, such a hard word, censored quartz ceramics. This was another material innovation that helped facilitate the development of professional perfumery. Today, we call it Egyptian faience. However, it shouldn't be confused with tin glazed faience. That was a European, much later product. Egyptian faience was essentially a self-glazing type of quartz-infused non-clay ceramic. And by the late Bronze Age, it was frequently employed for specialty vessels. From the perfumer's perspective, Egyptian faience brought together some of the best elements of earthenware and alabaster. It was strong and durable, so it was great for transportation. It was more porous than glass, but less porous than alabaster. And like earthenware, it was very easy to form, and it wasn't as labor intensive as stone carving. It also really had excellent plasticity, and it could be sculpted into many forms, as we can see here in the slide. Egyptian faience was also relatively inexpensive to make, but throughout its history, it was considered a semi-precious material and reserved for jewelry and luxury items. As such, faience vessels were practical for long-term storage because they were self-glazing, and they were visually dramatic and luxurious as a product. They also worked really well with molds. Molded faience vessels were widely produced in the late Bronze period and reemerged in commercial perfumery. Molding provided advantages for the vessel maker. So instead of hiring a highly skilled stone carver, you could have one vessel, mold it, cast it in a mold, and reproduce it 100 times exactly the same. Molding gave Egyptian faience a competitive edge in vessel production, small vessel production, just also at this moment where perfume was transitioning into the commercial market. Molding also made novel shapes that were once the reserve of very elite presentation vessels available to more modest commercial fare. And it was relatively more affordable, but it was part of the visual language of elite perfumery from an earlier age, and that mystique really held with it. But then, of course, there was glass. and glass changes everything. And I think you need to see what was coming before to see how important glass was. Glass changed the relationship between fragrance and form. While there's earlier evidence of man-made glass in the Near East going back much further, we don't see glass vessels start to appear in the Near East until the late 16th century, early 15th century BCE. And what made glass vessels possible, which I'm sure this audience is probably very familiar with, is the core form technique, where molten glass is draped and shaped over a core of removable material. Bronze Age glass, like perfumery, benefited greatly from the Temple Palace system and began as an ultra luxurious material that was really reserved for elite use. Based on luxury alone, glass had a place in the aesthetics of ancient perfumery. However, its enduring bond formed because glass was the first genuinely neutral containment material. It was impenetrable, it was inert, it was odorless, and it was sanitizable. The vessel fabric with glass no longer needed to be considered in the fragrance formula. This was revolutionary. This is the glass revolution and the contribution to glass to perfumery. And then, of course, and then the Bronze Age happened. The Bronze Age collapse happened, and it profoundly disrupted both trades. However, afterwards, the core form glass vessel did reemerge, and with it, it entered into commercialized perfumery. During this reemergence, however, the cost of glass production, its fragility, and its limited production sites kept glass perfume vessels in the realm of the Temple Palace perfumeries for considerably longer than alabaster and faience. Glazed pottery, which was by this point well established, was the affordable option. Non-elite glass cosmetic vessels appear more frequently in the material record starting at about the 6th century BCE. By this time, skilled artisans had returned glass to the trade metropoles of the regions, and these cities were once again hubs of luxury. There were new empires, and they wanted new fancy stuff. And the principal glass production centers also moved from rivers to coastal areas. So we see coastal Syria, Anatolia, Egypt, and Greece developing into these huge centers of glass production. Those same areas were also sites of fragrance production, and that is not a coincidence. These things were working together, clearly. During this period, we see glass vessels also duping semi-precious stone vessels. Agate and rock crystal presentation vessels could be intimidated, that's not the right word. They could be duped, shall we say, with banded and transparent glass. And these glass imitations, that's the word I wanted, were intended for those who could afford a commercial product, but really wanted to parallel the aesthetics of Temple Palace products, of really very elite products. Like faience, we also see new older forms that were established in other fabrics being reintroduced into glass. So the bes, the alabastron, the cretariscos, the amphoriscos, the araballos, all of these shapes were widely adopted into glass. And by the classical period, these vessel forms had already become part of the visual lexicon of fragrance, to which the glassmakers had to conform. Classical fragrance vessels had to convey market information like product type, potentially user's gender, and even hints about the product's origin, even if the vessel was made to be used multiple times. These commercial markets also brought new opportunities for expression. The glass press molded added texture and shape, giving novelty. Here we see a date shaped vessel, which is quite charming. Like molded faience, molded glass vessels could achieve uniform production on scale and quickly. Commercial perfumery greatly benefited from these new bottle forms, and likewise, the glass industry benefited from the commercialization of fragrance, which increased demand for these objects. So with this transition into more affordability, and affordability is in quotes here, we see the fragrance vessel morph from a precious reliquary to essentially a disposable form of packaging. From the Roman period in the Near East began in about 146 BCE when Rome first conquered Greece, and it reached its height in 117 CE. And during this time, there was new economic and social environments. the region was no longer seen as the center of the world, essentially, but instead as a periphery. Resources were not being exchanged as much as they were being extracted. They were being extracted to Rome. And it's in this environment where ancient perfume took its really kind of final form. During this time, Eastern Mediterranean areas were the center of glass and fragrance production and would remain so for a considerable amount of time afterwards. Rome was first introduced to perfumery through Greek and Egyptian culture, and they craved both elite and affordable fragrances and a whole lot of them. So feeding the beast became the center of the perfume market, which was to feed Rome. We see vessel innovation emerging at this time to feed this hunger. So, first recorded at around 50 BCE in Syria, glass blowing took the fragrance vessel to new states of spontaneity and grace. Blown glass achieved new levels of thinness and shaping with unprecedented professional finish. And it also made glass very, very accessible in a way it hadn't been in previous centuries. So I see these Roman bird vessels, these encapsulations, as the accumulation of the relationship between the ancient perfumer and the ancient vessel maker. Finally, after all of this time, it's complete encapsulation. This is accumulation of almost 2,000 years of artistic co-development and conversation. The vessel and the fragrance are one object here. They are a shared experience. This is an embodied sensory experience, not for a king, but for an average person who's going to break the bottle. They're going to break the tail off and they're going to use up all the fragrance and then it will be gone. It's the ephemerality that is the luxury. And it's in objects like this that we see two artisans truly working in synergy together. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much. And if we have any questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I learned a whole bunch, so I really appreciate it. We are close to our time, but there's one question that we can answer. Is there any indication of gendering of perfume production labor, particularly at that moment when it changes from this domestic kind of household production into a more artisanal production?
It's very fascinating. So we don't know about domestic production, where it may have laid. We have suspicions, but
Mhm.
we don't know. What evidence we have more written records from Mesopotamia than we do from Egypt. They probably started around the same time, but we have more artifacts from Egypt, more writing from Mesopotamia. What we see in Mesopotamia is men and women both working in the Bilthilsi, in the perfume workshop within Temple Palace Perfumery together, them having high-ranking people and a wide variety of people. So there are people moving all around in the ancient world to work in these royal perfumeries. So we have Egyptians living in Nineveh. We have people from Mari living in Egypt. So there's a ton of movement. Some of that movement may not have been to what people wanted to do. There's a fear of sort of enslavement and being associated with perfumery, particularly around women.
Mm.
And that actually, there's a line, I think in Samuel, about where I think is it Samuel or Isaiah? I have to look it up. Where he says, beware these foreign kings, they're going to take your daughters to be bakers and perfumers. So I think there was a fear about
Mm.
that. But what we see in the Mesopotamian texts is we see men and women all working in the temple palace systems together with very high rank. And then we see women start to fade out as it moves into a commercial market. And
Mm. Mm.
they're still there, but often their labor is being masked within family production. So the family is running
Mhm.
the perfume shop. There's a wife there. We're hearing about the wife, but we also have a lot less information from them because people were not keeping these deliciously um, pedantic records. So,
Yeah, thank you. One more quick question. Oh, Julie posted it. So about the bird perfume vessel that we have that you showed at the very end, about how breaking the tail might have been done. And we actually have a video that the museum produced about that. That's available at cmog.org/perfume. But if you just want to say a couple words about that bird vessel and the perfume in that.
Sure. It's actually really fascinating because these vessels were very, very fragile and were probably made very close to where they were sold. And it's not clear if those perfumes were made where they close to where they were sold
Mhm.
or if they were transported in to be put into the vessel. And the vessel would have been using blown glass techniques, but the glass would have had to have been not too hot when the perfume was poured in, because otherwise it would have scorched the perfume. So it's this very delicate balance of understanding what the glass needed and what the perfume needed, and then it would have been sealed at the tip and
Mhm.
sold like that. And what a wondrous form at the time. Now we see it with all the aromata settled, but it would have been swirling with color and just imagining them all set out on a table would have been very, very interesting to see. And someone who purchased this item would take it home and snip the end of the tail to access the fragrance within. And I think maybe they might have snipped the beak as well for airflow through. I'm not sure if that was the
Mm.
case. But then you would
Mhm.
sprinkle it and use it,
Mhm.
and you'd use it till it was done, and then it was done, and it got broken or put on the shelf and moved on. And just the at that point the idea of, oh yeah, this is just disposable is just crazy to me, because
Yeah.
it took so many resources and so much intelligent artisans to make these things. And that's just where they got to by the end of the Roman period. And it's
Yeah.
sort of where we are today as well.
Yeah. And I loved your point about the sort of narrow necks of so many of those bottles, just to keep it. Now, it's something I've observed, particularly in all those core form. It's not an easy shape to make and to
Yes.
extract. So why would you have those narrow necks with those sort of bulbous bodies? And that it's to keep those fingers and germs out. So yeah, I love this kind of form following the function concept. So
Yeah.
thank you again so much. Thank you to all our speakers today, all in this panel. And just a reminder to everyone that the sessions were recorded and they'll be available on Zoom if you want to rewatch anything or if you missed anything. And then we will have them on our YouTube channel within the next several weeks. So tell your friends to keep an eye out if you really enjoyed these sessions this morning. We'll be back in about an hour and 15 minutes at 2 o'clock Eastern time for our next session, which will be curating scent in the museum. So to get to that session, you'll exit out of this particular Zoom meeting and go back to the lobby where you were and enter into that session, which will again begin at 2 o'clock Eastern time, which is about an hour and 10 minutes from now. All right, thank you again, everyone.